The winter of 1198 brought news to the courts of Europe that would set in motion the destruction of the greatest Christian city on earth. Though none who heard Pope Innocent III's passionate call for a new crusade could have imagined such a conclusion. The papal chambers in the Lateran Palace echoed with the young pontiff's fervent prayers, his breath visible in the cold Roman air as he dictated letters to every crowned head and powerful lord in Christendom, imploring them to take up the cross once more and liberate Jerusalem from Saladin's successors. Innocent was barely 37 years old, the youngest man to occupy the throne of St. Peter in generations, and he burned with an ambition that matched his youth, believing that God had chosen him specifically to restore the holy places to Christian control and to establish papal authority over all the kings and emperors who claimed to rule by divine right. The failure of the Third Crusade still stung the collective memory of European nobility. Richard the Lionheart had won battles but not the war, and Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, a perpetual wound to Christian pride that festered with each passing year. In the castle of Écris-sur-Aisne, a small fortress in the Champagne region of France, Count Thibaut III stood before his assembled vassals on a November day in 1199 and announced his intention to take the cross, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the commitment he was making. Thibaut was one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in France, his lands stretching across the fertile plains where merchants travelled between Paris and the Rhine, and his decision carried immense weight among the warrior aristocracy, who looked to men of his stature for leadership in such ventures. The Count's younger cousin, Count Baldwin of Flanders, soon followed his example, as did Count Louis of Blois, and together these three magnates represented such concentrated military and economic power that their participation seemed to guarantee the crusade would actually materialise, unlike so many papal calls to arms that had withered into nothing when the nobility calculated the cost in gold and lives. What drove these men to mortgage their estates, to leave their wives and children vulnerable to rivals and rebellious vassals, to risk death by sword or disease in lands thousands of miles from home? The answer lay partly in genuine religious devotion. The medieval mind truly believed that dying in service of Christ would open the gates of paradise no matter how many sins one had accumulated in life, but also in the complex web of honour, shame and social competition that governed aristocratic behaviour, where refusing such a call marked a man as craven and diminished his standing among his peers in ways that could never be fully repaired. The Crusaders faced an immediate and insurmountable problem that would prove to be the crack through which disaster would eventually pour. They had no fleet. The Third Crusade had taught European military planners that the overland route through Anatolia was a death march, with hostile Turkish forces harassing every step and the brutal terrain claiming as many lives as any battle, so the sea route had become the only practical option for moving a large army to the Levant. Yet neither France nor the German states possessed significant naval forces, their martial traditions being entirely land-based, focused on heavy cavalry and siege warfare rather than maritime operations. The Italian city-states, however, had transformed themselves into naval powers of the first rank, their merchant fleets crisscrossing the Mediterranean, and their war galleys protecting the trade routes that brought spices from Alexandria, silk from Constantinople, and grain from the Black Sea ports to the markets of Europe. Venice stood supreme among these maritime republics, its lagoon harbours filled with vessels of every description, its arsenal shipyard capable of producing a fully equipped war galley in a single day when operating at full capacity, and its merchant princes grown wealthy beyond the dreams of most crowned heads through their monopolistic control of luxury goods flowing from east to west. 6 envoys departed from France in February of 1201, granted full authority by the crusading lords to negotiate whatever terms were necessary to secure transport for the army they intended to raise. These men were not mere messengers, but experienced diplomats and warriors in their own right, including Geoffrey of Villehardouin, the Marshal of Champagne, whose chronicle would later provide the most detailed account of the catastrophe to come, though his version would carefully obscure certain inconvenient truths about the decisions made in smoke-filled rooms far from the battlefield. The envoys travelled first to Genoa, where they found the Genoese willing, but unable to commit the necessary resources, then to Pisa, where they received similar responses, and finally they turned toward Venice, arriving in the lagoon city in the early spring when the Alpine snowmelt turned the Adriatic a peculiar shade of grey-green and the smell of salt and rotting fish pervaded every canal and campo. Doge Enrico Dandolo received them in the Great Hall of the Ducal Palace, a chamber decorated with Byzantine mosaics looted from earlier ventures in the East, and the envoys found themselves facing a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. Dandolo was, by the most conservative estimates, in his mid-80s, though some sources suggested he was well past 90, an almost impossible age for the medieval period when most men were dead by 50, and those who survived to 60 were considered ancient. The Doge was blind, or nearly so, the result of a head injury sustained decades earlier during a diplomatic mission to Constantinople, though the exact circumstances of this blinding would become a matter of fierce historical debate. Some claimed it was an accident, others whispered it was a deliberate attack by Byzantine officials, and this ambiguity would later fuel speculation about whether personal revenge motivated Dandolo's subsequent actions. Despite his age and infirmity, the Doge possessed a mind of crystalline clarity and a will that had bent the fractious Venetian nobility to his purposes for years, maintaining Venice's commercial supremacy against rivals and competitors through a combination of shrewd diplomacy and ruthless force. When the French envoys laid out their proposal, transport for 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 infantry, plus provisions for 9 months and horses for all the cavalry, Dandolo did not immediately respond, instead calling for a recess while the Venetian Great Council deliberated on this unprecedented request. The price the Venetians eventually named was 85,000 silver marks, a sum so staggering that it represented approximately twice the annual revenue of the Kingdom of France, and even the wealthy crusading lords would struggle to raise such an amount from their vassals and estates. But the Venetians sweetened the deal with an additional offer. They would provide 50 armed galleys at their own expense, manned and equipped, in exchange for half of all conquests made by the Crusade, whether in land or treasure. This seemingly generous offer contained within it the seeds of everything that followed, because it aligned Venetian commercial interests with the crusading enterprise in a way that would prove impossible to untangle when circumstances changed. The envoys, lacking any alternative, and convinced that the promised army would easily raise the required sum through a combination of taxation, borrowing, and the sale of movable goods, agreed to these terms and swore solemn oaths on holy relics that the crusaders would pay the full amount by the agreed-upon date. The Venetians, for their part, committed to a construction program that would consume the entire productive capacity of their shipyards for more than a year, effectively shutting down all other commercial shipping in order to build the transport vessels needed for this venture. Back in France and Flanders, the recruiting effort began in earnest, with preachers travelling from town to town describing the holy places defiled by infidel occupation and promising spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross. The response exceeded expectations in terms of enthusiasm, but fell catastrophically short in terms of coordination. Medieval armies were not centralised, professional forces under unified command but rather loose confederations of individual lords, each bringing his own household troops and vassals, each maintaining his own supply lines, and each free to interpret his crusading vow in whatever manner seemed most convenient. Many knights who took the cross assumed they could make their own arrangements for transportation, or decided to travel overland despite the known dangers, or simply changed their minds as the reality of the commitment settled upon them during the long months of preparation. The sudden death of Count Thibaut of Champagne in May 1201, possibly from illness, though some suspected poison, deprived the crusade of its designated leader and threw the entire enterprise into confusion, with various factions supporting different candidates to replace him before finally settling on Boniface of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman with extensive connections in the East, but also with ambitions that would prove dangerously misaligned with the original crusading mission. Boniface came from a family that had long involved itself in the tangled politics of the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states. His brother Conrad had been king of Jerusalem before his assassination in 1192, and another brother had married into Byzantine imperial family, giving Boniface personal stakes in the dynastic struggles that perpetually convulsed Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire in the year 1201 was a shadow of its former glory, its territories reduced to Thrace, Macedonia, parts of Greece and western Anatolia, With independent Greek states in Trebizond and Epirus ruling what had once been imperial provinces, and the city of Constantinople itself remained a marvel that dwarfed anything in Western Europe, its triple walls enclosing a population that estimates placed anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 souls, its harbours filled with merchant ships from every corner of the known world, its churches adorned with gold and silver and precious relics accumulated over 9 centuries of Christian rule. The empire's weakness invited predation, and various Western adventurers had already begun carving out fiefdoms in formerly Byzantine territory, while the Venetians and other Italian merchants had extracted trading concessions that gave them virtual extraterritoriality within the empire, creating states within the state that owed no allegiance to the emperor and paid no taxes to his treasury. The imperial throne itself had become a prize seized by whoever could command the loyalty of the palace guards and the urban mob, with emperors rising and falling in bloody succession as various factions within the capital manoeuvred for advantage. In 1195, Emperor Isaac II Angelos had been overthrown by his own brother, Alexios III Angelos, who had Isaac blinded and imprisoned, following the Byzantine custom of disqualifying rivals for the throne through physical mutilation rather than outright execution, which was considered somewhat less sinful in the Byzantine moral calculus. Isaac's son, who shared his father's name of Alexios, had escaped the coup and fled westward, eventually making his way to the court of his brother-in-law Philip of Swabia, the German king who was himself locked in a disputed succession with Otto of Brunswick for the title of Holy Roman Emperor. This young Alexios, later known as Alexios Thor, began making the rounds of European courts, seeking support for a restoration that would place his blinded father back on the throne with himself as co-emperor, and he came bearing promises that would prove both irresistible and impossible to fulfill. When Boniface of Montferrat visited Philip of Swabia's court in the spring of 1202, the fateful connection was made between the exiled Byzantine prince and the crusade leaders. Alexios offered terms that seemed to solve all the crusade's mounting problems in one stroke. If the crusading army would detour to Constantinople and restore him to his rightful throne, he would pay the Venetian transport fee that the crusaders were struggling to raise. He would provide an additional 200,000 silver marks for the crusade's expenses. He would contribute 10,000 Byzantine troops to the campaign in the Holy Land. He would maintain 500 knights permanently in the Levant at his own expense, and, most significantly for Pope Innocent and the papal agenda, he would bring the Orthodox Church under Roman obedience, healing the schism that had divided Christianity since 1054. These promises were, to anyone with even passing familiarity with Byzantine finances and politics, completely fantastical. As the empire was functionally bankrupt, the Orthodox clergy and people would never accept submission to Rome under any circumstances, and no Byzantine emperor could unilaterally commit to such sweeping changes without provoking immediate rebellion. But to French and Italian crusaders desperate for a solution to their financial crisis, and perhaps not entirely unhappy at the prospect of enriching themselves at Byzantine expense, the offer possessed an irresistible allure. The summer of 1202 saw the crusading army gathering at Venice, establishing camps on the Lido, the barrier island that separated the Venetian lagoon from the open Adriatic, and it was here that the full extent of the disaster became apparent. Instead of the 33,500 men that the envoys had promised when negotiating the transport contract, only about 12,000 crusaders actually appeared, and many of these were common soldiers with little wealth to contribute rather than wealthy knights, who could pay their own way generously. The crusaders pooled everything they could: gold and silver plate, jewellery, even the gemstones from sword hilts and reliquaries, and still came up 34,000 marks short of the agreed price. The Venetians, who had spent 18 months building a fleet specifically for this contract, and had suspended their regular commercial operations at enormous economic cost, were not inclined toward charity or flexible payment terms, and Doge Dandolo, that ancient and nearly blind master of negotiation, had the Crusaders exactly where he wanted them. The crusading army sat trapped on the Lido through the late summer heat, unable to leave without transport, unable to pay for the transport they had contracted, and unable to disband without breaking their crusading vows, and suffering eternal damnation according to the religious understanding of the age. Food supplies began to run short, Dysentery spread through the camps as it always did when large numbers of medieval people gathered in close quarters with inadequate sanitation, and fights broke out between different national contingents as boredom and frustration took their toll on discipline. The Venetians, meanwhile, maintained a careful blockade, preventing any ships from entering or leaving the lagoon that might offer alternative transport to the stranded crusaders, ensuring that no other solution could present itself to break the deadlock. Dandolo then proposed a compromise. The crusaders could defer payment of the outstanding balance if they agreed to help Venice recapture the city of Zara, a port on the Dalmatian coast that had recently rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, who was himself a crusader under papal protection, making any attack on his territories a direct violation of crusading principles. The crusader leadership agonized over this proposal with full awareness that they were being maneuvered into actions that contradicted their sacred vows, and several prominent nobles, including Simon de Montfort, who would later gain infamy for his role in the Albigensian Crusade, refused to participate and found their own way to the Holy Land by other means. But the majority, led by Boniface and swayed by Venetian arguments that this was merely a temporary detour necessary to make the crusade viable, agreed to the Zara campaign. Pope Innocent, upon learning of this plan, sent urgent letters forbidding any attack on Christian territory and threatening excommunication for anyone who participated. But his messenger arrived after the fleet had already sailed, or so the Crusaders later claimed, though suspiciously the papal letter was not read aloud to the army until after Zara had already fallen. The fleet that departed Venice in October 1202 was a sight that no one alive had ever witnessed. Nearly 500 vessels of all types, from massive round ships capable of carrying horses in specially constructed stalls to sleek war galleys with bronze-sheathed rams, their sails painted with crosses and the banners of various noble houses snapping in the wind, the whole armada stretching across the horizon like a floating city. Zara's walls rose directly from the water's edge, the city having been fortified by the Venetians themselves in earlier times, and the inhabitants knew they had no hope of withstanding a siege by such overwhelming force. Nevertheless, they hung banners marked with crosses from their walls, a desperate signal that they too were Christians and should not be attacked by crusaders. But the Venetian crews had spent too much time and treasure on this venture to be deterred by such niceties. The siege engines were assembled, the catapults began their work, and within 5 days the city's defenders requested terms. Zara was thoroughly sacked, with the Venetians taking careful inventory of goods and property that would compensate them for their investment while crusaders took whatever portable wealth they could carry, and the army settled in for the winter in the conquered city's buildings, ejecting the former inhabitants into the cold November rain. It was here, in the captured houses of Zara, that the proposal regarding the Byzantine prince Alexios was formally presented to the entire crusading army by Boniface and the Venetian leadership. The envoys of young Alexios laid out his promises with great eloquence, emphasizing the justice of his cause, restoration of a rightful heir against a usurping uncle, and the practical benefits that would accrue to the crusade from Byzantine assistance. The rank-and-file crusaders were deeply divided, with one faction arguing that they had already compromised their vows enough and should proceed directly to Egypt or the Holy Land, while another faction, led by the most heavily indebted nobles who desperately needed the Byzantine gold to pay off their Venetian obligations, insisted that this detour was both morally justified and strategically necessary. Passionate debates raged through the winter months, with several groups of crusaders attempting to desert and find their own way to the Holy Land, only to be forcibly brought back by armed detachments or prevented from leaving by Venetian control of shipping. The Dominican friars and other clergy travelling with the crusade were themselves split, some thundering denunciations of the plan from makeshift pulpits, while others crafted elaborate theological justifications for why attacking Constantinople to restore a legitimate emperor could be considered a holy act rather than a criminal diversion. Doge Dandolo, despite his advanced age, took the cross himself in a carefully staged ceremony that committed Venice officially to the crusading enterprise and aligned the city's commercial interests with religious obligation in a way that would make it almost impossible to separate legitimate trade concerns from sacred duty. The old man's motivations have been endlessly debated by historians. some seeing in his actions a brilliant strategy to eliminate Venice's main commercial rival by devastating the Byzantine Empire, others attributing darker personal motives related to his blinding decades earlier. Still others arguing that he was simply an opportunist taking advantage of circumstances as they developed. What cannot be disputed is that Dandolo's decision was the crucial factor that tipped the balance, because without Venetian naval support and without the fleet that Venice had built, the Crusaders had no capacity to threaten Constantinople, no matter what grandiose promises young Alexios made. The fleet departed Zara in April 1203, following the Dalmatian coast southward before crossing to Corfu, where more time was wasted while further contingents of Crusaders joined, and political arrangements were finalised, and it was not until late May that the Armada finally entered the Dardanelles and began the approach to Constantinople itself. The Crusaders, who had never seen the Byzantine capital, were struck dumb by their first view of the city as the fleet rounded the point of the Bosporus and the full expanse of Constantinople's walls and towers and palaces spread before them. Villehardouin, in his chronicle, wrote that no man, no matter how brave, could see such a sight without trembling, for the city seemed so vast and so heavily fortified that it appeared impregnable to any conceivable assault. The triple walls on the landward side rose in terraced tiers, the inner wall standing 40 feet high with towers reaching 60 feet, and these fortifications had never been breached by foreign enemies in the 800 years since their construction, having turned back Huns and Avars and Arabs and Bulgars in endless succession. The Crusader fleet anchored at Chalcedon on the Asian shore opposite Constantinople, and a delegation was sent to the city to present young Alexios to the people and demand that they acknowledge him as their rightful emperor. The Byzantine response was underwhelming, to put it mildly. The inhabitants of Constantinople had seen pretenders and usurpers come and go with such regularity that one more claimant to the throne, backed by foreign mercenaries, generated more contempt than enthusiasm, and Alexios III, the reigning emperor, showed no inclination to surrender power merely because his nephew had returned with a Western army. The Byzantines had reasons for confidence beyond their formidable walls. They possessed Greek fire, that terrifying incendiary weapon whose composition remained a closely guarded state secret, which could burn even on water, and had destroyed countless enemy fleets over the centuries. They had a navy of their own, including massive dromons that could ram and sink the relatively fragile Venetian galleys, and they assumed that the traditional Byzantine diplomatic strategy of bribery, delay, and exploiting divisions among enemies would work as effectively against these Latin Crusaders as it had against so many previous threats. The Crusaders established a fortified camp at Galata, the commercial suburb on the northern shore of the Golden Horn, and their first objective was to break the massive chain that stretched across the harbour mouth, preventing entry into that sheltered anchorage. This chain, each link as thick as a man's arm, was suspended on wooden floats and had protected the Golden Horn for centuries, but the Venetian galleys attacked the tower that held one end of the chain, overwhelming its defenders through sheer ferocity and numerical superiority, and once the chain was broken, the entire Crusader fleet swept into the harbour, seizing control of the waterfront and enabling supplies to be landed directly from ships rather than having to be hauled overland. The first assault on the walls themselves came on July 17th, 1203, with the Venetians attacking from the seaside, while the French knights attempted to breach the landward defences, and here the different military traditions of the two forces became apparent. The Venetians, experienced in amphibious operations, rigged their ships with flying bridges and scaling ladders, essentially using the tall masts and yards as mobile siege towers that could be brought directly against the sea walls, while the French insisted on traditional cavalry charges that accomplished nothing against stone fortifications 40 feet high. Dandolo himself, ancient and blind, stood in the prow of his galley flying the banner of St. Mark, urging his men forward with a voice that somehow carried over the din of battle, and the Venetian assault succeeded in capturing several towers along the seawall, forcing the Byzantine defenders to retreat toward the interior of the city. But the French attack stalled completely, unable to make any impression on the land walls, and a dangerous gap opened between the two forces that might have been exploited by a more energetic Byzantine commander. Emperor Alexios III, however, proved as incompetent militarily as he was politically, and when a sortie by Byzantine forces was repulsed by the Crusaders with moderate casualties, the emperor panicked, gathered what portable treasure he could carry, and fled Constantinople entirely during the night, abandoning his throne and his people to whatever fate awaited them. This unexpected collapse of imperial resistance left the Byzantine leadership in chaos, and a faction within the city decided that the path of least resistance was to release the blinded Isaac II from prison and restore him to the throne along with his son Alexios IV, exactly as the Crusaders had demanded, apparently hoping that once the young prince was emperor, he would pay off the Westerners and they would depart. The Crusaders withdrew to Galata and waited for their promised payment, but the new co-emperors, upon examining the actual state of the Byzantine treasury, discovered what anyone familiar with the empire's finances could have told them. There was no possibility of raising the 200,000 marks that Alexios had promised. The empire was effectively bankrupt after decades of mismanagement, and the depredations of Italian merchants who paid minimal customs duties while controlling most profitable trade. Alexios IV attempted to raise funds through extraordinary taxation, and by confiscating church property, melting down sacred vessels and even stripping silver fittings from the Hagia Sophia, and these sacrilegious acts turned the population against him while still producing only a fraction of the needed sum. The co-emperors managed to pay 50,000 marks through these desperate expedients, enough to partially satisfy the Venetians and keep the Crusaders from immediate revolt, but nowhere near what had been promised, and as summer turned to autumn and then winter, it became increasingly clear that the young emperor could not and would not fulfill his commitments. The Crusader army remained camped outside Constantinople through the autumn of 1203, consuming supplies and growing increasingly restless as it became apparent that they were stuck in an impossible situation, unable to continue to the Holy Land without the promised Byzantine support, unable to extract that support from an emperor who lacked the resources to provide it, and unable to simply leave without being pursued by Venetian creditors demanding payment for the transport contract. Fights broke out between Crusaders and Byzantine citizens whenever the two groups came into contact, with both sides showing contempt for the other's military prowess and religious practices. The Latins viewed the Greeks as effeminate and treacherous, prone to backstabbing and poisoning rather than honest combat, while the Byzantines saw the Westerners as crude barbarians, unwashed and ignorant, who had somehow stumbled into possession of military technology that their limited intellects barely allowed them to operate. These mutual antagonisms were not new. The cultural divide between Greek East and Latin West had been widening for centuries, exacerbated by theological disputes and commercial rivalries. But the forced proximity of Crusader camp and Byzantine capital turned abstract disdain into visceral hatred. A massive fire broke out in Constantinople in August 1203, started either accidentally by Crusaders looting a mosque in the Muslim quarter, or deliberately as an act of ethnic violence, depending on which source one believes, and this fire raged for 3 days, consuming entire neighbourhoods and leaving tens of thousands of people homeless just as winter approached. The Latin merchant communities within Constantinople, primarily Venetian and Pisan traders who had lived in the city for generations, found themselves targeted by angry mobs who blamed all Westerners for the fire and the general catastrophe that had befallen the city, and these Italian communities fled to the Crusader camp, bringing with them both tales of Byzantine atrocities and commercial intelligence about the city's defences and wealth that would prove useful in the coming months. The relationship between the co-emperors and the Crusaders deteriorated through the winter as payments fell further behind schedule, and young Alexios IV found his authority challenged by his father Isaac II, who despite being blind remained politically astute enough to recognise that his son's promises to the Latins were destroying what remained of imperial legitimacy. In January 1204, a palace coup brought to power Alexios the Archdukas, known as Mortzuflos due to his prominent eyebrows, a son-in-law of Alexios III who had been playing various factions against each other with considerable skill. Mortzuflos strangled young Alexios IV with a bowstring, the traditional Byzantine method for discreet imperial murder, while Isaac II conveniently died of natural causes at almost the same moment, removing both co-emperors and allowing Mortzuflos to claim the throne as the saviour of the city from Latin exploitation. The new emperor immediately ceased all payments to the crusaders, strengthened the city's defences, and began preparing for the inevitable assault, correctly calculating that the crusaders were now trapped by their debts to the Venetians, and would have to attack Constantinople to seize by force what they could not obtain through negotiation. This murder of their imperial puppet gave the Crusader leadership the perfect justification for what they had probably intended all along: a full-scale assault and sack of the richest city in Christendom, which would simultaneously pay off their Venetian debts, enrich every participant beyond their wildest dreams, and perhaps, if anyone still cared, provide resources for an eventual campaign to the Holy Land. The treaty negotiated between the Venetian leadership and the Crusader lords in March 1204 laid out in remarkable detail how the anticipated plunder would be divided, with Venice receiving 3/8 of all conquests, and the remaining 5/8 divided among the Crusader nobles according to their rank and the size of their contingents. And this document reveals that the sack of Constantinople was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence by undisciplined troops, but a carefully planned commercial venture with predetermined profit-sharing arrangements. The treaty also established the procedure for selecting a new emperor to rule the Latin Empire that would be created from Byzantine territories, with 6 Venetians and 6 Crusaders forming an electoral committee, and this advanced planning for governing a conquered empire demonstrates that any pretense of merely helping a legitimate claimant recover his throne had been completely abandoned in favour of naked imperialism. The assault was scheduled for April, after the winter storms had passed but before the summer heat could bring disease to the besieging army, and the Venetians again took the lead in developing the tactics that would breach the formidable sea walls. The key innovation was the construction of flying bridges between pairs of ships, lashed together and approaching the walls in tandem, so that even if the waves caused one ship to drop away from the wall, the bridge would remain supported by the other ship, allowing attackers to maintain their footing during the crossing. The Venetians also constructed siege towers on their largest ships, protected by hides soaked in vinegar to resist Greek fire, and equipped with drawbridges that could be dropped onto the tops of the wall towers to create instant boarding platforms. The first assault, launched on April 9th, failed catastrophically, with Byzantine defenders using their height advantage to rain down stones and boiling oil and Greek fire onto the attacking ships, forcing the Crusaders to withdraw after suffering significant casualties and minimal gains. This defeat sent shockwaves through the Crusader camp, where many began to doubt whether the city could be taken at all, and the more religiously motivated Crusaders started demanding that the army abandon this sacrilegious siege and proceed to its original mission in the Holy Land. 3 days later, on April 12th, the Crusaders attacked again, benefiting from a strong north wind that drove the ships harder against the walls and also created enough chaos among the defenders that 2 Venetian ships managed to establish a foothold on the wall towers. Once a section of wall was secured, Crusaders began pouring through the breach, and although Byzantine forces attempted to contain the penetration, the discipline and cohesion of the defence began to crumble as word spread that the walls had been breached. Emperor Mortzuflos personally led several counterattacks, showing considerably more martial spirit than his predecessors. But medieval Byzantine armies were not the legendary legions of earlier centuries, and the heavily armoured Western knights proved superior in close combat to the lighter-equipped Greek soldiers. By nightfall, the Crusaders had secured a significant portion of the wall and established fortified positions within the city, and during the night Mortzuflos fled, following the now established tradition of Byzantine emperors abandoning Constantinople when facing imminent defeat. What followed over the next 3 days was one of the worst catastrophes ever to befall a Christian city, an orgy of violence and destruction that shocked even the relatively jaded medieval world, and poisoned relations between Western and Eastern Christianity for centuries to come. The Crusaders had been promised 3 days of free pillage before order would be restored, and the systematic division of plunder according to the treaty terms would begin, and they made full use of this license, breaking into homes and palaces and churches without distinction, seizing gold and silver and jewels, assaulting women regardless of age or social status, and destroying what they could not carry away out of sheer vandalism. The Venetians, more disciplined and focused on commercial value, made straight for the warehouses and treasury buildings, carting away not just precious metals, but also silks and spices and other trade goods that could be sold in Western markets. The artistic and cultural destruction was incalculable. Bronze statues from classical antiquity were melted down for their metal value, ancient manuscripts were destroyed or scattered, religious relics accumulated over centuries were distributed to Western churches with no record of their provenance or significance, and the damage to the city's infrastructure, from burned buildings to destroyed water systems, would take generations to repair, if indeed it was ever fully repaired. Contemporary Byzantine sources written by survivors of the sack describe scenes of almost apocalyptic horror: drunken crusaders using icons for firewood, horses stabled in churches with their dung fouling the altars, ancient libraries burned to provide light for soldiers searching for hidden treasure, and everywhere the cries of the violated and the murdered mixing with the victorious shouts of the looters. The Crusaders showed particular contempt for Byzantine religious practices, smashing icons which they considered idolatrous, mocking Greek liturgical customs, and in the Hagia Sophia itself installing a prostitute on the Patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs, while knights drank communion wine from sacred chalices. These acts were not merely crimes of opportunity by undisciplined troops, but reflected deep-seated Western contempt for Greek Christianity, and the conviction among many Crusaders that the Greeks were effectively schismatics or heretics whose punishment was divinely ordained. The clergy travelling with the crusade made little effort to restrain these excesses, and some actively participated in the looting of churches, justifying their actions with the argument that bringing Byzantine relics to the West would make them accessible to more worthy Christians. The total value of the plunder extracted from Constantinople is impossible to calculate with any precision, but contemporary estimates suggest it exceeded 400,000 silver marks, making it the largest single transfer of wealth in medieval European history up to that point. And this figure does not include items whose value was primarily artistic or religious, rather than monetary. The systematic division of this plunder according to the prearranged treaty terms took months, with appointed commissioners cataloguing and valuing goods, and many crusaders who tried to conceal their takings to avoid sharing were excommunicated or punished, though enforcement was necessarily incomplete given the scale of the theft. Venice's share included the 4 famous bronze horses that now adorn St. Mark's Basilica. Seized from the Hippodrome, where they had stood since being brought from Rome by Constantine himself, along with countless other artworks and relics that would be distributed to Venetian churches and used to enhance the city's prestige and sacred geography. Individual crusaders carried relics back to their home churches throughout France and Flanders, with fragments of the true cross and bones of obscure saints suddenly appearing in provincial monasteries, whose priests were delighted to receive such treasures without asking too many questions about their provenance. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople proceeded according to the electoral provisions laid out in the treaty, with the selection committee ultimately choosing Baldwin of Flanders as emperor, a decision that represented a compromise between the Venetians, who wanted a weak emperor they could control, and the crusading nobility, who wanted someone with sufficient prestige to command respect. Baldwin was crowned in the Hagia Sophia in May 1204, using Byzantine imperial regalia and attempting to appropriate the ceremonial forms of Byzantine monarchy, while filling his court with French and Italian nobles who had no understanding of the complex administrative traditions that had made the Byzantine Empire function for 1,000 years. The Venetians, showing greater practical sense, focused not on titles, but on territories, securing for themselves a string of islands and coastal strongpoints that would serve their commercial interests, including Crete and much of the Peloponnese, effectively creating a Venetian maritime empire in the eastern Mediterranean that would last for centuries and provide the foundation for Venice's transformation from a regional power to a major European state. The division of Byzantine territories among crusading nobles created a patchwork of Latin kingdoms and duchies throughout Greece and the Aegean, with the Kingdom of Thessalonica going to Boniface of Montferrat, the Duchy of Athens established for Otto de la Roche, and various other lordships parcelled out to lesser nobles according to their contributions to the conquest. These Latin states were fundamentally unstable from their inception, being imposed by a small military elite on a Greek population that hated them, and they faced immediate resistance from Greek successor states that had formed in regions not conquered by the Crusaders, particularly the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia and the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece. both ruled by Byzantine aristocrats who claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire, and worked tirelessly to expel the Latin intruders. The Latin Empire itself would last only until 1261, when Michael Vaith Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople and restored Byzantine rule. Though the recovered empire was a feeble remnant of its former self, permanently weakened by the catastrophe of 1204 and unable to resist the expanding Ottoman Turks, who would eventually conquer Constantinople in 1453, Pope Innocent III's reaction to news of the conquest initially reflected horror at what had transpired, and his letters to the crusading leaders expressed shock that men who had taken vows to liberate Jerusalem had instead ravaged the greatest Christian city in the world, with particular condemnation for the sexual violence and the desecration of churches that even by the relaxed standards of medieval warfare were considered beyond acceptable limits. However, the Pope's outrage was tempered by political calculation. The conquest had apparently achieved the submission of the Greek Church to Rome, one of the papacy's long-standing goals, and the establishment of a Latin empire created new opportunities for papal authority in the East. Within months, Innocent had essentially forgiven the Crusaders and was working to consolidate Catholic control over formerly Orthodox territories, appointing Latin bishops and establishing monasteries that would serve as instruments of Romanization, though this religious imperialism proved no more successful than the political variety, with the Greek population stubbornly maintaining their Orthodox faith and viewing the Latin ecclesiastical hierarchy as illegitimate occupiers no different from the military conquerors. The crusade to Egypt and the Holy Land, the original purpose that had motivated this entire enterprise, never materialized in any meaningful form, though some crusaders did eventually make their way to the Levant in small groups that accomplished nothing significant, while others settled permanently in the conquered territories around Constantinople, establishing themselves as a new feudal aristocracy, ruling over Greek peasants who worked the land with sullen resentment. The Fourth Crusade thus achieved none of its stated religious objectives, while succeeding brilliantly at its unstated commercial and political goals, enriching Venice and various crusading nobles, while destroying the Byzantine Empire's capacity to serve as a bulwark against Turkish expansion into Europe. The long-term consequences of 1204 extended far beyond the immediate destruction and death toll. The sack poisoned relations between Catholic and Orthodox Christians in ways that persist even into the modern era, with many Orthodox believers dating their fundamental distrust of the West to the betrayal of Constantinople, and the elimination of Byzantine power created a vacuum in the Eastern Mediterranean that eventually enabled the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans and the transformation of southeastern Europe's religious and political landscape. The individual participants in the Fourth Crusade met varied fates that perhaps reflected divine judgment or merely the randomness of medieval life, depending on one's theological perspective. Doge Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205 at the extraordinary age of perhaps 97, having achieved Venice's transformation into a Mediterranean superpower, and he was buried in the Hagia Sophia, where his grave marker remained visible until the Ottoman conquest. Emperor Baldwin survived only 1 year on his throne before being captured by the Bulgars in battle, and dying in captivity under circumstances that later generations would romanticize, but that probably involved simple execution, followed by the Bulgar king using his skull as a drinking cup, according to steppe nomad customs. Boniface of Montferrat, who had perhaps done more than any other individual to divert the crusade toward Constantinople through his connections with the exiled Byzantine prince, was killed fighting Greeks in 1207, his severed head sent as a trophy to the Byzantine successor's state in Nausea. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, whose chronicle provides our most detailed account of these events despite its obvious bias toward justifying the Crusader actions, lived to old age and prosperity in Greece, his descendants ruling the Principality of Achaia for several generations before Greek resurgence expelled them. The 10,000 knights, or thereabouts, who participated in this venture could not have known as they made their crusading vows in French castles and Flemish towns that they were signing up not for a holy war against Islam, but for the destruction of Eastern Christianity's greatest city, and it remains unclear how many of them recognized the magnitude of the betrayal they were committing, or whether the combination of debt, strategic confusion, and Venetian manipulation had trapped them in a situation from which there was no honourable escape. The medieval mind's capacity for reconciling contradictions through theological rationalization allowed many crusaders to convince themselves that attacking Constantinople was justified by Byzantine schism and treachery, that the Greeks had brought this catastrophe upon themselves through their doctrinal errors and political incompetence, and that somehow this detour would ultimately serve God's purposes even if the immediate results seemed to contradict every stated goal of the crusading movement. The more cynical participants, particularly among the Venetian merchant class and some of the heavily indebted nobility, likely understood perfectly well that they were engaged in a criminal enterprise dressed in religious garments. But the profits were sufficiently enormous that ethical qualms could be suppressed or ignored, especially when those profits meant the difference between financial ruin and dynastic prosperity.